The pond had always been there, quiet, still, cradled in the gentle dip behind the Whitmore farmhouse, where wild grasses swayed like slow breath in the breeze. Locals spoke of it in passing as one does an old, forgotten clock in the attic. It kept its own time. It remembered things others had long let go. Clara Whitmore returned to the farmhouse one dusky afternoon, her boots brushing the dust off the road like soft sighs. The house had been locked for years after her grandmother passed. No one in town thought she'd come back, not after the headlines, not after the whispers. But there she was, key trembling between her fingers, turning into a door that seemed reluctant to open. Inside, the air felt heavy, but not hostile, just aged, like it had been waiting without holding its breath. The floral wallpaper had faded to ghost pale, and the living room smelled faintly of lavender and something like old paper. Clara moved carefully through each room, her gaze brushing the furniture as though it might stir. She hadn't meant to go to the pond that evening, but some pulley thread she couldn't see led her down the sloping path behind the house. The pond lay cradled in twilight, its surface smooth as glass. Trees lined the water like quiet sentinels, their reflections stitched into the dusk. Clara stood at the edge, arms folded against the chill that had begun to creep in. That's when she saw it. A second reflection. A woman. Not herself. Not quite. Clara didn't move. The air seemed suspended. In the pond's mirror, the woman stood behind her, wearing a white dress that rippled like smoke in water. Her face was turned slightly, as though listening. Clara spun around. No one. Only the trees. Only the hush of evening. She looked back into the water. The second reflection had vanished. Only herself now, just Clara, wrapped in dusk. She tried to shake it off. Maybe the light. Maybe memory. Maybe her own tiredness playing tricks. But even as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the pond had recognized her. Not just seen her, but remembered. That night, she lit a single candle by her grandmother's bedside, the same one where stories had once been whispered during storms. She lay on the quilted blanket, staring at the ceiling where the moon cast delicate lines through the lace curtains. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it carried the scent of wet earth and lily. The next morning, Clara found something by the kitchen door. A single footprint in mud. Bare. Small. Like a child's. The door had been locked. She pressed her hand to the pane of glass, staring out toward the trees beyond the pond. Something had shifted. Not violently, but purposefully. Like a curtain drawn back slightly in a room she hadn't entered yet. The locals had always said the pond was haunted, but never cruel. That it only showed things. Reflections. Regrets. She hadn't believed them then. Now, she wasn't sure. By the time the sun began its quiet descent again, Clara was back on the trail behind the house. Drawn once more. Her grandmother used to say the pond had moods. That it could be sad. Or lonely. That it missed the people who forgot to come back. Clara stood at its edge once more. No reflection but her own. And then, just as she turned to leave ripples, not from a breeze, not from anything she could see, as if something beneath had stirred ever so gently, calling her name in the stillness. The following day began with the soft hush of wind combing through the trees, brushing against the windows like an old friend asking to be remembered. Clara rose slowly, still wrapped in the layers of dreams and unsettled quiet from the night before. She couldn't recall everything, only flickers a child's laugh, the sensation of wet grass beneath her feet, and the sound of something dripping in the dark. She dressed without thinking, pulling on a sweater that smelled faintly of cedar and long-closed closets. The morning coffee sat untouched as she stared out the kitchen window, her eyes drawn once again to the sloping path that led to the pond. It was too early to go back, but she knew she would. Before she did, she ventured into the attic. She hadn't been up there since childhood, but something in her stirred with the memory of whispered stories and dust-covered photo albums. The wooden steps creaked under her weight, and a single strip of light slashed across the floor through the small attic window. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, many bearing her grandmother's careful handwriting. Clara opened one marked Summer 1952 and found photographs of picnics, pressed flowers, letters yellowed by time. She reached into another, this one unmarked, and pulled out a leather-bound journal with fraying edges. The handwriting inside was unmistakably her grandmother's, but it was Messier here, less sure. Scattered between recipes and observations about the garden were entries that pulled Clara's breath tight in her throat. She's still by the pond. Some evenings I see her. White dress. Hair like mine. She never speaks, just looks. Not sad. Not angry. Just waiting. And then, a few pages later, she's getting bolder. I woke to the sound of my name, and the back door was open. Footprints on the floor. Too small to be mine. Clara closed the journal softly, almost as if afraid it would sigh as slammed shut. She placed it back in the box and let her fingers linger on the lid before pulling it closed. There had always been stories of her grandmother talking to shadows, of lights flickering when no one was home. But Clara had thought it was just age or grief. Now it felt like something else. Later that afternoon, she found herself back by the pond. The wind had settled. The trees stood still, like breath held in a silent room. She waited, not sure for what. Clara. The voice was soft, like it had traveled a long distance, like it hadn't been spoken in years. She turned. No one. Her pulse quickened. She scanned the trees, the water, the path, but all was still. Only the soft movement of the pond's surface and the faint whisper of leaves. She took a step forward, her boots crunching the gravel. Then another. At the very edge of the pond, she knelt. The water lapped softly. She reached out and let her fingers touch the surface. It was warmer than she expected, and just as her fingertips disturbed the glass-like calm, a shape emerged in the reflection. A girl, small, barefoot, hair long and damp, clinging to her shoulders. Eyes wide, dark, and steady. Clara blinked. The girl didn't vanish. She stood up quickly, heart pounding, but this time she didn't run. She kept her eyes on the reflection, not daring to look behind her. The girl in the water tilted her head, like a question left unspoken, and then slowly raised one hand. Clara, almost without thinking, mirrored the motion. Her own hand rose, shaking slightly. A gust of wind broke the surface of the water, shattering the image. The girl was gone. The trees returned. The clouds above. Clara's own wide-eyed reflection staring back. That night she didn't sleep in her grandmother's bedroom. Instead, she curled up on the worn couch in the sitting room, the journal cradled to her chest. The candlelight flickered as the wind outside picked up, brushing the shutters like fingertips against old wood. And just as she began to drift, she heard it again. Not a voice this time. A lullaby, soft, wordless, like someone rocking gently in a chair beside her, just out of sight. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains, casting a golden hush across the floorboards. Clara sat up slowly, the weight of the journal still in her arms, and the last note of the lullaby echoing faintly in her memory. She didn't speak. She barely breathed. The room felt like it hadn't fully let go of the night. She stood and walked barefoot into the kitchen, her steps unusually light, as if trying not to disturb something she could no longer see. The air smelled of old coffee and wood polish. The back door remained locked. Yet on the windowsill above the sink, she noticed something that hadn't been there before. A single lily, fresh, dew-kissed. She reached for it with careful fingers. There was no vase, no note, no explanation. Just the flower resting where it didn't belong. Clara's mind circled back to the reflection. The girl, the journal entries, the stories whispered in her childhood about a child who'd once drowned in the pond, though no one had ever named her. Just pieces of rumor stitched together by old women on porches. Clara had never given it weight. Not really. But now, she spent the afternoon digging through more attic boxes. Beneath linens and rusted tins, she found a photograph tucked in the fold of an old apron. It was faded and grainy, but the image was unmistakable. A little girl, standing by the pond, smiling shyly with her hands clasped in front of her. Her white dress billowed faintly, caught in a wind from long ago. On the back in soft pencil, Eleanor, 1963. She loved the water. The name hit Clara like a slow exhale. It sounded familiar, not from stories but from within, as though she'd heard it in dreams. She kept the photo with her as she wandered back down the path behind the house. The pond reflected a wide sky, scattered clouds floating like feathers above it. Clara knelt again by the edge and held the photo just above the water. "Is this you?" she whispered, voice barely carried by the breeze. Nothing stirred. No ripples. No voice. But then she felt something. Warmth against her hand. She looked down. A soft shimmer beneath the surface. Not light, something else. A glow that moved like it was breathing. And slowly from the center of the pond, bubbles rose. Not frantic, gentle, like laughter held underwater. And then something broke the surface. Not a figure, an object. It floated toward her slowly, carried by invisible hands. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing its edge. A small wooden horse, weathered by time, its paint chipped, its legs uneven. The kind of toy a child might carry everywhere. She held it to her chest, suddenly and inexplicably close to tears. Behind her, the trees swayed with a low murmur, and for a moment, Clara thought she heard footsteps on the path behind her. She turned quickly. Nothing. But the silence was thicker now. Expectant. She stood and made her way back to the house, the toy tucked safely in her coat pocket. That evening, she placed it beside the lily on the windowsill. 2 offerings now. two pieces of something quietly stitching itself together. Later, as the stars began to blink awake, Clara lit the fireplace and wrapped herself in the same shawl her grandmother used to wear. The warmth didn't quite reach the chill that curled around her ankles, but she didn't mind. She read through more of the journal, page by page, like pulling back the layers of someone else's long-held memory. And there, in one entry dated November 3rd, 1963, she found it. Eleanor hasn't come home. The pond is still. Too still. I keep hearing her giggle in the trees. I leave her toy horse on the porch every night. Just in case. Clara looked toward the window. The pond wasn't visible in the dark, but she could feel it. Waiting. Remembering. She closed her eyes to the sound of crickets, the low whistle of wind, and once more that lullaby. Only this time the notes were clearer, closer, as if someone was humming it just behind her, gently rocking and watching. Clara didn't wake with a start. She woke slowly, like someone rising from under deep water eyes, adjusting to morning light, breath sensing again with the world around her. The shawl had slipped from her shoulders sometime in the night, and the fireplace had long gone cold. The house felt different now, not threatening, but full, as if something unseen had finally settled in. She sat up, stretching stiff limbs, and reached for the journal on the floor beside her. The page she'd last read was still marked with a dried, leaf-thin amber, fragile. She traced her fingers over the words about Eleanor, about the missing child, the pond, the toy horse. Something inside her ached, not from fear, but from recognition. Downstairs, the windowsill held the lily and the wooden horse, exactly as she'd left them. But now there was a third item, a small ribbon, faded pink, tied in a bow. Clara's breath caught gently in her chest. She hadn't seen a ribbon like that since childhood, since her grandmother had tied her hair before church on cool Sunday mornings. She reached for it, the fabric soft as breath, and for a long moment she simply held it. No note, no explanation, just the quiet knowledge that she wasn't imagining things anymore. She decided to go into town. The drive to Maple Hollow was short, but slow. Her tires crunched over the winding road framed by cottonwoods and rustling oaks. The town square was just as she remembered. The cafe still had the crooked sign above the door. The post office still leaned a little too far to the left. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Inside the library, the air smelled of yellowing pages and soft dust. Miss Garland, the librarian, blinked at Clara as though seeing a ghost herself. After brief pleasantries, Clara asked if there were old town records, particularly from the early 1960s. Miss Garland led her to the archive room in the back, where boxes lined the walls and cabinets groaned with paper. Clara combed through birth records, missing person reports, school lists. And then, just as she'd begun to lose hope, she found it. A newspaper clipping. Local girl vanishes. Foul play not suspected. Eleanor May Baird, age 7. Last seen playing by Whitmore Pond. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. No conclusive evidence. The article speculated she may have wandered off and gotten lost. A paragraph mentioned how the pond had been searched, drained partially, but nothing was ever found. Clara stared at the small, grainy photo accompanying the piece. It was the same girl from the attic photo. Same shy smile. Same hair. same dress. The date, October 29th, 1963. Just a few days before her grandmother's journal entries turned erratic. Clara folded the clipping carefully and tucked it into her coat pocket. As she left the library, she felt the weight of Eleanor's story settle deeper into her chest. Not heavy, but steady. Like an old melody you only half remember, but somehow never forgot. That evening, Clara returned to the pond. This time she came with intention. She wore her grandmother's shawl, brought the ribbon, the lily, the toy horse, and the photo of Eleanor. She arranged them gently along the edge of the water, each item placed with care, like offerings at a shrine. The surface of the pond reflected the sky, now streaked in lavender and peach. "I remember you," Clara whispered. "You were never just a story." A breeze stirred the grasses, then the trees, then the water. The pond shimmered faintly, and a single ripple spread from the center, outward slow, soft, and even. Clara didn't look away. She knelt beside the offerings and bowed her head. The air around her held a stillness that felt like listening, like something receiving her words, not judging, not deciding, just hearing. The moment passed gently. The sun dipped below the trees, and as Clara turned to walk back up the hill, a hush fell behind her. Peaceful. No footsteps followed. No songs were sung. Just the sound of the earth breathing, and a little more space inside her where fear used to live. Night returned like a slow tide, folding its arms gently around the farmhouse. Clara lit a candle in the kitchen, not out of necessity, but out of reverence. The electricity worked just fine, but the soft flame felt more appropriate, more respectful, as if the house itself preferred the quiet flicker over the modern hum of light. She placed the ribbon and toy horse on a plate by the windowsill, as though presenting them at a table meant for two. Outside, the pond remained unseen, cloaked in darkness and moonlight, but she could feel its presence, not watching, not waiting, just there. She boiled water for tea, her hands moving without thought. The kettle whistled low, and she poured the steaming liquid into one of her grandmother's old teacups. China thin, rimmed in faded gold. That's when she heard it. A soft thud. Then another. From upstairs. Her first instinct was stillness. No fear, no panic, just the kind of deep pause one takes when listening for something old and familiar. She moved slowly up the staircase, her candle casting shifting shadows on the wallpapered walls. The sound hadn't repeated, but the air had changed charge slightly, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. At the top of the stairs, the door to the sewing room stood ajar. Clara hadn't opened it. She stepped inside. The room smelled of cedar and lavender sachets tucked long ago into drawers. A single chair sat beside the window, and on the seat resting neatly, as though placed with care, was another item. A small silver brush, child-sized. The bristles were clean, the handle warm to the touch. Clara picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hand. It was engraved with a faint floral design, and on the back, the initials EMB. Her breath caught. Not out of fear, out of awe. She sat in the chair, the brush resting in her lap. Through the window, she could just make out the reflection of the moon glinting faintly on the pond's surface. And then, as if guided by instinct or memory, she began to hum. Not the lullaby, not exactly, but something close. The melody came to her slowly, like it had been resting somewhere deep inside, waiting to rise. The room seemed to soften around her. The air warmed, and for a moment she swore she could feel someone behind her. Not close enough to touch, just near. Clara didn't turn around. She kept humming. The presence stayed with her for several long moments, and then it faded, like breath on a mirror. She stood and set the brush back down gently on the chair. As she turned to leave the room, she noticed something strange. On the wall, behind the door, was a small series of pencil marks. A child's height chart. Names and dates scribbled faintly beside the lines. Eleanor's name appeared again and again. She had been here, in this room, in this house, growing, laughing, living. Her absence had become a ghost, but she had once been real. Back downstairs, Clara wrote Eleanor's full name on a small piece of paper and placed it with the lily and the photo. A name spoken aloud was a kind of remembering, but written down, it felt sacred. Later that night, Clara fell asleep on the couch once more, wrapped in the shawl, the candle burning low beside her. The wind outside rustled the porch, swaying gently. Floorboards creaked in the rhythm of settling bones. And somewhere, just outside the edge of dreaming, Clara heard it again. Laughter. Not haunting, not eerie, just a child's simple joy echoing through the trees. And then quiet, the kind that feels full, not empty, as if something had finally been acknowledged, as if someone had been seen. Morning arrived gently, its light filtering through the trees and dappling the kitchen walls like water through lace. Clara woke to the soft scent of the lily, still fresh, still radiant. The little paper with Eleanor's name sat untouched beside it, though now it looked less like a note and more like a promise. She made toast she didn't eat and brewed coffee she didn't drink. Her mind wasn't in the kitchen anymore. It was at the pond, in the sewing room, in the hush between footsteps and memory. Later that morning, she walked to the edge of the property where the old mailbox stood crooked on its post. She hadn't checked it since she arrived. Inside was nothing, no letters, no flyers, not even a spider's web. But as she turned to go, she noticed something tucked into the grass just beyond the gravel drive. A child's drawing. Faded from weather, the paper soft with time. Stick figures, one tall, one small, holding hands beside what was unmistakably the pond. The sky was scribbled with blue and pink, and there was a sun with a smiling face in the corner. At the bottom, a name, Eleanor. Clara knelt and picked it up gently, her fingers brushing over the image like she was tracing history. It didn't feel like something left by mistake. It felt placed, offered, like a page from a book slowly reopening. She walked back to the house, the drawing fluttering softly in her hand, and placed it with the other items on the windowsill. The little altar of memory was growing. Each object told a truth that had once been silenced. But Clara was listening now. That afternoon, she returned to the attic. There was one box she hadn't opened yet, the one marked with no name, just a blue ribbon tied tightly around it. It took effort to untie the knot, like the box had been holding its breath. Inside were more journals older, more brittle, and at the very bottom, a bundle of letters tied with string. The ink was smudged in places, but she recognized her grandmother's writing. They weren't addressed to anyone. They were written for someone. Each one began the same way. "My sweet Eleanor." Clara read slowly, the words curling gently into her chest. The letters weren't about loss. They were about presence, about how Eleanor's laugh still echoed through the halls, how her toys still moved from room to room, how sometimes the candle would flicker when her name was spoken. "You're still here, aren't you?" One letter said, "I hope you know I see you. I always will." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper. Recognition. She had always felt like an outsider in this family, distant from the whispers and the silences. But now she understood. Her grandmother hadn't been haunted. She'd been in communion. That night, Clara carried the letters down to the pond. She laid them gently on the grass beside the photo, the ribbon, the toy, the brush, the drawing. One by one, she lit the edges and let the pages burn, their ash lifting like smoke signals into the dusk sky. Not to erase, but to release, to acknowledge. The flames whispered for only a moment, then faded into glowing embers. The pond remained still. The trees offered no rustle. And in that silence, Clara felt something shift, something weightless and soft, as if a door had quietly opened somewhere deep within the land. She stayed until the stars appeared, her shawl wrapped tight, the moon catching in her hair. When she finally turned to leave, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because for the first time, the pond didn't feel like it was holding something. It felt whole. The following morning, Clara didn't rise with urgency. There was no call from the pond, no pull of the unseen. Just the soft welcome of light pouring through the lace curtains, and the peaceful hum of a house that had stopped holding its breath. She moved through the kitchen in quiet rhythm, setting the kettle on the stove, folding the dish towel with care. Her movements had changed, not cautious, but deliberate, as if every gesture meant something now, as if she was no longer just a guest in the house, but a part of it again. She glanced at the windowsill. The objects remained, the lily, the photo, the ribbon, the horse, the drawing, but something new had joined them. A small seashell, pale and smooth with a faint pink spiral. The kind a child might carry home from a trip and forget on the windowsill years before anyone remembered it was there. Clara picked it up slowly. Her grandmother had never been to the ocean. Neither had Eleanor. Or had she? She turned the shell in her hand, wondering what stories it held. The thought didn't frighten her anymore. It felt comforting now, like the past was gently rising to the surface, not to startle, but to be witnessed. Later, she visited town again, not to research, not to ask questions, but to listen. At the cafe, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched people drift in and out. She overheard familiar voices, older women trading recipes, a child asking for extra syrup on their pancakes, the local mechanic grumbling about carburetors. But in one quiet moment, she heard it. A name. Eleanor. Not spoken loudly, just murmured. She turned slightly and saw two elderly women seated near the back, heads tilted toward one another. "Do you remember that little girl? Disappeared years ago, down by the Whitmore place." "Eleanor Baird," the other replied. "So sad. Never found her, did they?" "No. But I always thought she never really left." Clara didn't interrupt. She didn't introduce herself. She simply sipped her tea and let their words settle like dust on an old piano. Soft, familiar. On her way out, she stopped by the general store and picked up a handful of simple supplies candles, string, fresh matches. As she placed them on the counter, the woman ringing her up gave her a look of gentle curiosity. "You're the Whitmore girl, aren't you?" Clara nodded, unsure if the question carried weight or just memory. "Funny thing," the woman said, bagging the candles. "Your grandmother used to buy the same ones. Every fall, like clockwork." Clara smiled faintly. She liked rituals. The woman paused, then added, "She once told me there's a difference between haunting and remembering. One clings, the other honors." Never forgot that. Clara left the store with the words folded in her heart. That evening, back at the farmhouse, she lit the new candle and placed it at the pond's edge. The sky was streaked with soft pinks and deep purples, the colors of endings that never quite feel like goodbyes. She sat beside the water, humming the lullaby, again this time with words that came gently, unbidden. Not made up, but found. Like stones in a stream. "Sleep now, little echo, beneath the willow's bend. No need to call or wander. You're home again, sweet friend." The pond shimmered under the gathering twilight. No reflections moved. No shadows stirred. Only peace. As she stood to leave, she felt something brush her hand. Not wind, not rain, a warmth, a touch, like small fingers saying thank you. She turned, but nothing was there. Just the grass, the trees, the pond, and the story they now shared. It was a quiet afternoon when Clara found the final letter. The sun had tucked itself behind a thin curtain of clouds, and the air felt like a held breath. She was dusting the shelves in the sitting room, the same ones her grandmother used to polish with rose-scented oil, when her fingers brushed against something caught between two old books. She pulled it free. An envelope, yellowed, unsealed, addressed in her grandmother's hand, to the one who stays. There was no stamp, no return address, just those 5 words. Clara sat down slowly, her knees folding under her like they used to when she was a girl sitting at her grandmother's feet. She opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. The letter was short. No salutation, no signature. If you are reading this, you've heard her. You've seen her. Not everyone does. The pond does not call to many. Only to those who remember without being told. Only to those who are still listening when the rest of the world forgets. She was never lost, just left. And she never wanted revenge, only return. Keep her in your breath. Speak her name when the wind stirs the curtains. Leave small things for her to find. That's all she asks. You don't need to fix what happened, only to see it. That is enough. Clara sat for a long while after finishing. The house felt fuller now, not with ghosts, but with stories. The kind that live in floorboards and worn quilts. The kind that stay even when no one speaks them aloud. That evening, she decided to set the table. She brought out her grandmother's best china, the plates rimmed with violets, the silverware polished smooth by decades of use. She prepared a simple meal: tea, biscuits, soft cheese, apples sliced in crescent moons. At one end of the table, she set a place for herself. At the other, for Eleanor. No words passed between them. Just a hum of presence. Just the stillness of a table set for more than one. Outside, the wind stirred faintly. The candle flickered once, then stilled. After the meal, Clara gathered the objects on the windowsill, one by one. The lily, the ribbon, the brush, the photograph, the drawing, the shell. Each item placed gently into a wooden box, lined with velvet torn from an old cushion. She wrapped the box in a shawl and carried it down the path to the pond. The moon had begun to rise, soft and golden. The water was glass again, undisturbed, receptive. Clara knelt at the edge. She did not speak. Instead, she unwrapped the shawl, opened the box, and gently placed each item on the water's surface. One by one, they floated, drifting toward the center as if drawn by an unseen hand. And then, slowly, they began to sink. Not all at once, but as though being received, welcomed. Each item leaving behind only a ripple. Clara remained there until the last ring of movement faded. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She simply listened, and in the hush of that moment a memory stirred, not hers, but one gifted to her. Laughter. A girl's joy. Running feet on damp grass. A voice calling from the porch. Time to come in now. And then stillness. Content. Whole. Clara rose and walked back up the path, her hands empty but her heart fuller than it had been in years. The farmhouse waited, windows glowing gently like eyes that understood. And for the first time since returning, Clara felt that she wasn't keeping vigil. She was keeping company. The days that followed unfolded like soft linen, drying in the breeze, simple, unhurried, and without fanfare. Clara spent them in quiet rhythm, tending to the house, sweeping the porch, refolding linens long undisturbed. Not out of duty, but out of care. The farmhouse had stopped feeling like a place she'd returned to and started feeling like a place she had always been part of, as if her presence had filled a shape long left unoccupied. One morning she found herself humming the lullaby, again, not because she heard it, but because it now lived in her. She didn't visit the pond every day, but when she did, it was like checking in on a friend. The water remained still, peaceful. The reflection she saw now was only her own. Yet there was never a moment she felt alone. She had come to understand that Eleanor was not a shadow, not a wound, but a thread that had never been cut, just left untied. One evening, while watching the sun melt into the trees, Clara felt moved to write. Not in her grandmother's journal, but in a notebook she found in a drawer. The pages were clean, the binding stiff, but as she wrote, the words flowed easily. She wrote about Eleanor, about the girl who waited and the woman who came back, about how memory isn't always a clear picture. Sometimes it's a scent, a sound, a name that echoes even when no one says it aloud. She wrote as though Eleanor might read it, or had already lived it, or perhaps was sitting beside her, nodding along with each sentence. The more she wrote, the more she realized she wasn't recording the story. She was finishing it. Later that night, a soft knock came at the door. Not a sound she expected. Not loud. Not forceful. Just 3 soft taps. She opened it without hesitation. No one stood there. Only the breeze, warm and earthy, like the breath of late summer. And at her feet, a single item, A dried lily, the same kind that had once bloomed fresh on her windowsill. Clara bent to pick it up. The petals crumbled slightly in her fingers, but the scent still clung faint, sweet, grounding. She pressed the lily into the notebook like a final punctuation mark. Not an end, but a closure. That night, she slept without the candle burning. She no longer needed its glow to feel safe. Instead, she let the moonlight do what it had always done, cast soft silver across the wooden floors, make shadows that danced rather than loomed. Sometime near midnight, she woke briefly. Not startled, just stirred. From the hallway, she heard the creak of the sewing room floorboards. She didn't rise. She didn't investigate. She only smiled, pulled the quilt up over her shoulder, and drifted back into sleep. Because not all footsteps need to be chased. Some are just reminders that love lingers, that memory listens, that not every story ends with silence. Some settle into the walls, into the wind, into the hearts of those who choose to stay. The seasons began their slow turning, and the farmhouse softened into the landscape like a story woven into the earth. Clara moved with a calmness she hadn't known she was capable of, as if the days were stitches binding past and present together. Her visits to the pond grew less frequent, but each time she came, it felt less like a search and more like a greeting. The water's surface remained smooth, holding no secrets except those it had always carried. One late afternoon, while clearing out an old cupboard, Clara found a bundle of pressed flowers, wild violets, daisies, and forget-me-nots wrapped in faded ribbon. She recognized a careful handwriting on the note tied around them. For Eleanor, my forever girl. Her fingers trembled as she held the flowers. They seemed to carry the weight of years, love, and quiet sorrow all at once. She carried them outside and placed them gently on the earth near the pond's edge, where the grass was soft and the breeze carried the scent of pine. The wind stirred, rippling the water, and for a moment, Clara imagined the figure of a little girl skipping through the tall grass, laughter ringing clear and light. That night, she lit a fire in the hearth, the flames casting warm shadows on the walls. The house seemed to breathe with her, alive in the glow of memory and acceptance. As she settled into her chair, Clara pulled the journal closer and began to write not her grandmother's words, but her own. She wrote about loss and healing, about the unseen connections that thread through time, about the ways we carry those we love, even when they're gone. Outside, the moon traced silver paths across the sky, and the pond reflected its light like a quiet witness. Clara's voice joined the night, humming the lullaby softly once more, a promise carried on the breeze. Sleep now, little echo. Beneath the willow's bend, no need to call or wander. You're home again, sweet friend. She closed the journal and let the quiet fill the room. Some stories never end. They simply become part of us. The morning was cool and clear, the kind that carries a whisper of autumn even before the leaves have fully turned. Clara moved through the house with a calm she hadn't expected to find in herself. The farmhouse, once heavy with absence, now felt warm alive with memories held gently rather than weighed down. She paused by the kitchen window, watching sunlight dance on the glass. Outside, the pond shimmered softly in the distance, a steady presence she had come to know like an old friend. In the weeks since the letters, the offerings, and the quiet rituals, Clara noticed subtle changes. The creak of floorboards felt less like ghosts pacing and more like the house settling with relief. The shadows on the walls softened into shapes that felt familiar and kind. That afternoon, she found herself in the sewing room again. The height marks on the wall remained faint but clear, and Clara traced the names written there with a gentle finger. Eleanor's name was etched there like a quiet testament, not a mark of loss, but a sign of life once lived fully. She pulled the silver brush from the chair and ran it through her hair, the cool metal grounding her. The lullaby hummed again on her lips, a steady thread weaving past and present. Outside, a soft wind stirred the trees. Clara stepped onto the porch and breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of pine and earth. She realized then that the pond's stillness was not emptiness. It was peace. She had come seeking answers and found something quieter, something gentler, closure. Not in the way stories end with a bang or a scream, but with a sigh, a breath, a whisper. The pond would always be there, a mirror reflecting not just what was lost, but what had been found. And Clara knew she was no longer just a visitor in this place. She was home. The days grew softer as summer folded into fall, the farmhouse embracing the turning season with a gentle sigh. Clara moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, carrying the weight of memories that no longer pressed down but lifted like warm light. The pond nestled behind the house remained a place of stillness, its surface calm, reflecting sky and trees without disturbance. It no longer held secrets to be uncovered, but stories to be held gently in the heart. One evening, as twilight deepened into night, Clara sat by the fire, the journal resting in her lap. She read the final entries aloud in a voice soft and steady, as if sharing a lullaby with the shadows. The house listened. Outside, the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, a child's laughter, clear and untroubled. Clara closed the journal and stood, moving to the window to gaze out toward the pond. The moon cast silver light across the water, a quiet guardian watching over the place that had become both mystery and home. She thought of Eleanor not as a ghost, but as a presence woven into the fabric of the land, a reminder that some spirits do not seek to frighten, but to be remembered. The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. And as Clara finally turned away from the window, the house held its breath no longer. The story had found its resting place. Not all spirits seek to frighten. Some just wish to be remembered. If their tale lingered with you, let it rest with your breath. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, maybe it's just the end of the story.